I may have been 8 to 9 years old. I lived in a nice little middle-class neighborhood. One of my best friends, Raven, lived across the street diagonally, one house down, so I often spent evenings at her home after school. Raven's mom would always call my mom to let her know I was leaving and to expect me in the next minute or so. This way, Mom knew to unlock our front door. Often, she stood and watched from the screen door to make sure I got across okay. I'd begun noticing the speed-up red car, possibly an old Volkswagen or Buick, that would pass by almost every night as I ran back across the street. I would always head home just after dark, so possibly around 8:30, any time I was leaving Raven's house. It was always rolling super slow. Speed limit was 25 miles per hour, and I want to say this vehicle always passed at maybe half that. One night, as I was leaving, perhaps a bit later than usual, I stepped out of the side door of Raven's house, just as the car was about to pass the house completely. It stopped in the road and backed up as I approached the side of the road. The window rolled down, just as the car stopped in front of me. A little woman with short reddish-brown hair and blue-framed glasses was smiling sweetly at me. "Hi, sweetheart. It's a little late for you to be out right now, isn't it?" she asked me. Her voice was low and pleasant. "No, Mom lets me. I'm just walking home," I replied stupidly. "Oh gosh, how silly of your mom. There's all kinds of bad people out late at night. Where do you live? I'll give you a ride." Just then, my mom came bursting out of her front door and screamed, "Leave her alone," as she began running to me. The woman's pleasant demeanor dropped, and I heard her mutter a word, possibly "fuck," as she slammed her foot on the gas and took off at well over the speed limit. She didn't stop at the nearby stop sign, just blasted through it to make her escape. I got a nice lecture that night, but also had a lot of tight hugs. My mom was super glad that she had chose to look out of the storm door to check on me, instead of just letting me wander home. I could have been taken, and she told me as much. I cannot remember if the police were called, but I never interacted with any officers. This doesn't end here, though. Like most little kids, I really liked setting up lemonade stands. Unlike most little kids, I also enjoyed hand-making and baking cakes and brownies and cookies, and also selling those at my lemonade stands. About 2 weeks after the prior incident, a beautiful sunny Saturday, my mom helped me with the baking and helped me make my lemonade and set me up in the front yard with my sign. She had been paranoid ever since the prior incident and had hardly let me out of her sight, aside from school and the bus, and this was no different. She stayed outside with me, all while I sold my little treats to passerbys, until she had to run to the restroom. It would obviously be a pain to take everything down and bring it inside while she went, and then to bring it all back out and set it up again. She figured I'd be okay for a few minutes, considering it was the middle of the afternoon, and usually predators aren't that stupid. Mom left me alone for several minutes while she went to the bathroom and presumably went to grab a snack as she was gone for 10 or so minutes. A familiar face walked up about 8 minutes in. She appeared from around some bushes down the street. I didn't see her in the distance walking up. I honestly saw her stand up from behind some bushes and brush herself off and begin walking towards me. Her clothes were smart and sophisticated looking, almost like a pantsuit. It was a real clash with how ratty her car had been, but that same placating smile was on her face, and her eyes glinted behind the same glasses. "Aw, cute, a lemonade stand. Hi again, sweetie. Sorry for bothering you the other night. I didn't realize how close to home you were." "Mama told me not to talk to you. Go away." I said it as meanly as I could muster, but Mom had, rightfully, made me so frightened of this woman that I'm sure I just sounded like the scared little girl I was. "Come on now, Marie." She spoke my real name, first and last, and my eyes got big. "I'm a friend of your parents. I live down the street, remember? We met at the pool this summer." I had no recollection of her. "If you're their friend, why did you leave so quick?" "Mom!" I began shouting for my mother. This made her crouch down in front of my table, eye to eye with me. We don't need to do that. I just want to talk to you. You like to bake, right? I have a really fancy kitchen with a nice baker's oven. All sorts of cool gadgets to make baking cupcakes and stuff like this. Super fun. No, 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 no. Mom! I stood up and pushed the table into this woman and started running for the front door. This woman kicked the folding table away and started to chase me until my mom appeared in the doorway. She flung the door open and I barreled into her, and the woman stopped running and stood in the yard. "What are you doing to my daughter?" my mom shouted at her. "My God, your child is rude. I was just trying to buy a cupcake, and she shoved the table into me and ran. Now I have lemonade all over my clothes." The woman lied through her teeth. I don't think she was expecting my mom to come back. "That's the lady from that night in the car." I was now trying to get around my mom and hide behind her. My mom pulled out her cell phone, and this time I know she called the police. The woman immediately ran off back in the direction she came. The cops appeared. One took statements while the other one patrolled the neighborhood searching for her. They ended up finding her car parked at the grocery store that was up the road, about half a mile at the other end of the neighborhood. They waited for her to show up and claim it. She never did. They couldn't find her. I never saw her again, though. I'm a bartender at a small dive bar in my hometown. The place is over 100 years old, and we're a cash-only spot with cheap booze and a lenient bar buyback policy. The clientele is generally older men and a few women who are locals and hardcore regulars. I recognize almost every person who comes in the place. I know about 75% on a first-name basis, and have only been there about 7 months. Because of some ridiculous, long-standing tradition, I'm also the first female bartender the bar has ever had. It's not that important, other than the bar doesn't have any sort of security in case of a problem with customers. The bartender is largely expected to take care of issues on their own and without calling the police. We'll get points on our liquor license for police calls. I've had my fair share of obnoxious drunks, disgruntled customers, overly affectionate people, etc. But the guy who came in the other day takes the cake for creeps I've interacted with. I'm working my usual Sunday morning shift, which means I've opened at about 9 a.m. Our town abolished blue laws pertaining to alcohol sales, so we start serving people as soon as the doors are open. And my porter, young guy, shows up to help me man the bar while I do our monthly inventory. A few regulars come in around 9:30, and the shift goes pretty well until about 11:30 when this guy walks in. I don't recognize him at all, which is pretty strange, and I can tell there's something off about him. First off, I could smell him from a few feet away, and he just absolutely reeks of cigarettes. Like damp, weeks-old, ashtray-packed cigarettes. He's also wearing these greasy button-up track pants, worn-down Converse, and a baseball hat covering what can only be described as a horrible, straw-like hairpiece. He walks in like he's already had a couple of drinks in him. I continue my work in the stockroom, but I'm still within earshot of the bar. The first thing out of the guy's mouth to my porter behind the bar is,
"I don't really have any money, but I couldn't resist coming back in this place. Last time I was here, I got a BJ in the bathroom before I shipped out to Vietnam."
Some of the regulars laughed, and my porter gave a half-hearted chuckle. One of the regulars, let's call him Billy, offers to buy the guy a drink, since he was in Vietnam, and Billy was too. Billy starts asking him questions like, where were you stationed, and what company did you serve with? And immediately, you can tell the guy is lying. He starts making up names to fake Vietnamese cities, and claims that he's worked in special ops, with directions only from Nixon. Billy knows the guy is a bullshitter, and, not wanting to start a fight, just starts ignoring the guy and leaves soon after. But this creep is persistent and pathological. He proceeds to tell about 30 more lies in rapid fire that were both chronologically impossible and unprompted, but oft repeated. He claimed having helped design the Chrysler Building, making $2 million a year as the president of the United Swiss Bank, dating Cindy Crawford, and meeting Donald Trump. He told me he knew Don had the potential back then. At this point, my porter has left, and I'm working the bar until the afternoon bartender gets in. The creep has chased nearly every regular out of the bar, and have gotten half of them to buy him a drink out of pity or annoyance. Unfortunately, while I've been able to do busy work behind the bar and avoid the guy except to pour him the occasional drink, he's now the only one in the place, and I kind of have to talk to him. The guy's been lying or ranting all morning, but his tone starts to shift more sinister. He keeps talking about Donald Trump and how the grab him by the pee tape made him want to vote for the guy even more. I told him that's pretty fucked up and that the video offended a lot of people. He started apologizing and calling himself an asshole, insisting he didn't mean it. Then he starts ranting about liberals and Democrats and says that they all should be taken out back and shot in the head. I tell him that's a horrible thing to advocate for and entirely undemocratic. He apologizes again and then says,
"It's because you're so pretty that I'm saying all these stupid things."
At this point, I should have asked him to leave. He hasn't paid for a drink, he's run my customers out of the bar, and now he's going to start hitting on me. But he's a biggish dude, drunk, and an appreciation for violence. Plus, I'm a female alone in this situation. I figured I can avoid having to ask him to leave, since there's no one left to buy him a drink, and he can't possibly expect me to serve him for free forever. He'll get thirsty and move on to the next poor pub. Much to my chagrin, he pulls out a wet-looking $10 bill and asks for another scotch. I'm hesitant, but pour him one, because a sale is a sale at this place, so I've been taught again and again by my boss. He drinks and keeps telling me I'm beautiful, have such nice eyes, lips, etc. I'm respectable looking on my best days, and maybe a solid 6 on bad days, so I'm not someone strangers compliment regularly. This guy is obviously trying to be especially endearing in his own twisted mind. Then he says,
"I'd like to kiss you."
And I immediately reply, well, that's not going to happen. And he kind of angrily says,
"I know that. I'm just kidding with you."
Then he whispers really softly. I'm not 100% sure he said this.
"There's other things I'd like to do with you."
I'm definitely creeped by this guy, and I'm close to asking him to leave and hoping he doesn't give me any actual trouble. But it's 12:45, and the afternoon bartender should be there by 1, so I think I can wait it out. He started talking about baseball and how he announced for the Yankees, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we've passed the peak creep mode. Then I made the worst mistake. I needed to come out from behind the bar to draw up the chalkboard sign with our specials for the day, and I really wish I hadn't. Up until that point, I had been behind the bar, so there was a physical barrier between me and this guy. When I went to draw the sign, there wasn't anymore. At first, he stayed at the bar, kind of muttering to himself, while I set up the chalkboard easel on one of the tables in the pool table area. As I started drawing, I see this guy walk up to me in my peripheral. He got his drink in his hand, and he's kind of wobbling towards me. He compliments my handwriting for the sign. I thank him, and he starts talking again about how pretty I am and what a nice body I have. I roll my eyes and just ignore the comments. Then, all of a sudden, he reaches out and puts his hand on my shoulder. At first, I think he stumbled or trying to gain his balance, but then he starts rubbing my neck. It's not aggressive, just fucking uncomfortable and unasked for. I stepped away, tell him to stop, and ask him what he thinks he's doing. Then he starts apologizing and making some excuse about pretty girls making him nervous. I asked him not to do it again, to please let me work, and then I turned my back to the easel propped up on the table in front of me. I kept working about 5 minutes when I hear him put his drink down on the table behind me and walk back up to where I'm standing. The next thing that happens only lasts about 10 seconds. but it feels like forever. I'm about to turn around and ask him to back up when he grabs me in a bear hug and leans against the table. I immediately tense up. My heart is racing, and I can't gather my thoughts on what to do. All I can think is, what the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? I snap myself out of my shock, push myself back off the table, and yell, "What the fuck, man?" He starts apologizing and muttering some bullshit excuse about something falling while I screamed at him, "Get the fuck out or I'll call the police. The owners live upstairs and I'm going to alert them right now." He grabs his jacket off a bar stool and sprints out the door and up the street towards the beach. Not 10 minutes later did my relief bartender show up. I was kind of still shaken, so I recounted the story to him and we told the owners the whole thing. We put the guy on permanent 86, so he's not allowed back ever again. We also have instructions to call our special officer for help handling anything like this in the future. So, if you're reading this, creepy, pathologically lying, pervert hugger, let's not meet. I also hope you fall in a ditch. I, 18 female, was young when it happened, probably 9 or 10, so some of the details are a bit fuzzy. At the time, I definitely didn't find it to be a big deal. Only recently, I've been thinking about it, and I realized how creepy the whole thing was. My mom believes it's one of the scariest things to ever happen to her, and that she genuinely feared for our safety at the time. We were driving late one night, and it was just me, my mom, and my dad. Eventually, we got a bit turned around, and I think this was still a time when iPhones were relatively newer to my family and not the best quality, so my dad pulled into a bar to ask for directions. It's completely dark out, and he gets out of the car with it still running to go inside. A couple of guys are standing on the porch of the establishment, and they're eyeing me and my mom alone in the car. After a couple of minutes, one of them comes out and seems to be coming towards our car, but goes to a truck next to us. He fiddles around in it for a few seconds. Then he gets out and makes it seem like he'll go back to the porch with his buddies. Instead, he turns at the last second, tugs at our door handle, and sits in our driver's seat. Clearly, he is intoxicated. He's older, maybe 50s or 60s. The car is still running, mind you, and nothing is stopping him from doing something reckless, like changing the gears. He starts talking to my mom, and it's clear she's uncomfortable. He says something like,
"Oh, I just want to go on a ride."
And my mom is nervously playing along, probably in an attempt to placate him enough so he doesn't try anything. My mom mentions a couple times that my dad is just getting directions inside and that he'll be back any second. Eventually, the man does get out, and my mom locks the doors. His buddies are all laughing and continue staring at us. When my dad comes back out, the drunk guy stops my dad and says he was joking around with us. I know when my dad got back in the car, my mom was furious because she hadn't wanted to stop at the bar in the first place. He definitely didn't see it the way she did. He took it as a harmless drunk guy and that it was fine because nothing happened. Looking back, the situation had so much more potential to go wrong. Me and my mom didn't have anything to defend ourselves, and there was nothing stopping him from driving off in the car with us. It's amazing the things we brush off at a young age, and only later we realize how dangerous it could have been. This encounter would have happened a little over 10 years ago. I would have been 26 to 27 male at the time, but I cannot 100% remember what year this was now, but it was sometime from 2011 to 2013. At the time, I was frequently going out with friends to bars and parties and hanging out until pretty late most weekends. The friend's house that I usually hung out at was on a side street just off a main road where a lot of popular and crowded bars and restaurants were. You had to park on the street at his house, and during the weekend when it was busy, it was pretty common to have to park a number of blocks away. The street closer to the bars was pretty nice, but if you went a few blocks in the opposite direction, it got a little sketchier at night. After a night of hanging out, I had to walk back to my car pretty late, which was parked a number of blocks away towards the slightly sketchier area. This was during the winter, so I was wearing some kind of heavy sweater or pullover and a beanie knit hat. This detail is only important as you couldn't really gather much idea about what I looked like from a distance in the dark, aside from my general height and build. There wasn't much through traffic as you got further away from the bars, and the roads were pretty dark without any streetlights. As I was walking down the sidewalk, a car slowly started creeping down the street, matching my pace as it pulled up beside me and then stopped. The window of the car rolled down, and driving the car was an attractive young woman who said that I looked cold and that I should let her give me a ride to where I was going. She seemed very friendly. I indicated that I wasn't parked far away and appreciated the offer, but was going to just keep walking. She then tried really hard to convince me to get in the car with her, since it was so cold. No small talk to establish any information about me to make sure I wasn't a weirdo. Just asking me to get in the car pretty aggressively. Based off what I was wearing and how dark it was, there was no way she could have had much idea about what I actually looked like to possibly find me attractive. And even if she did, I don't know many women who would pick up a male stranger after midnight when they're alone in their car. There were about 10 bars nearby she could have gone to if she just wanted to pick up a guy. There was no reason I could think of that she would have to resort to driving around, offering to pick up strangers. She continued to drive alongside me and offered me a ride again, which I declined and kept going. I picked up my pace, and she eventually drove off. As soon as she was a few blocks away, I quickly got in my car and made sure there was nobody lurking around or close by. The whole scenario felt off, and it didn't make sense to me. I asked my friends about it later, and all of the women agreed that they wouldn't offer a random guy a ride at nighttime in that kind of scenario, even if the guy looked like Ryan Gosling or Channing Tatum. My suspicion is that there was someone laid down in the backseat of the car, out of view, with a weapon, waiting to rob anyone who accepted the ride. I couldn't really figure out any reason she would be offering rides like that to complete strangers in the middle of the night, as it would be very unsafe for her to just pick up random strangers. I just assumed that there had to be something nefarious going on in that car, and I do wonder what would have happened if anyone just hopped in the car with her. I work overnight at a store. I'm a stalker, 25 female. When I first started, a guy around my age got hired a couple months after me. He started hanging around another coworker and I on break, and we eventually became friends, even hanging out alone on break sometimes. He seemed pretty normal at first, agreeable, and a good conversationalist. He told me he was autistic, which I think helped me make excuses for him a bit in hindsight. I was in a bad place mentally at the time, and having someone validate me felt nice at first. But then he started getting touchy. I would eventually be telling him more personal stuff, and he would start to rub my back. I didn't want to be rude at first, so I didn't say anything, but then he did it more often. I told him to stop, and he seemed to be sorry, until doing it again, eventually. I was alone with him all these incidences, and the look on his face when he did, eventually, showed predatory vibes, and not like the friend I thought I had. Around the time he started doing this, he also confessed to me something he did in the past to a friend of his. You can probably guess what it's along the lines of. He acted quite remorseful and said him and the friend are civil now and that it was a long time ago. I think he also cried a bit. I'm generally a compassionate person who believes in second chances. So while this is when more red flags started going off, I still hung out with him a bit, although more distantly. It didn't help that his general demeanor is, one of a pitiful person. Nice act. He hung out with my boyfriend and I a couple of times. He lives near us, so we were kind of excited to have someone to hang out with at first. But he just keeps getting weirder and weirder the few times we hung out. He always seemed to be trying to subtly one-up my boyfriend in a sarcastic manner. There was also a strange time when he did a deep belly laugh at an explicit sexual song playing on his car radio that my boyfriend and I just felt kind of uncomfortable about. He'd make a point to not drink that much around us when we were drinking, despite bragging about how much he could down. He rubbed my back yet again at one point while I was drunk, when my boyfriend left the room, trying to pass it off as comforting. He generally tried to be flirtatious whenever my boyfriend left the room. Eventually, enough was enough, and I cut him off, although I still have to work with him. This was last summer. We weren't even friends for that long. Since then, he has come in early every night to put out my work stuff for me, leaves me food and water and gifts, stuff that I've mentioned in conversations before, parks near me and waits for me to leave the parking lot so we can drive together, I guess. One time he waited a half hour as I was chatting with another coworker. He waits in front of his house for me to pass by him to get home. I have to turn onto his road to get to my road. He still says weird phrases my boyfriend and I used. Texts, despite being ignored. Left a note saying,
"You really do hate me,"
on my work cart after months of ignoring him. He's written my full initials, which he remembers somehow, on a work cart in marker and leaves the same one out for me every day. I always try to erase them, even wrote "stop" on it once, but the next day I'll see he wrote them again. Oh, and whenever he walks by me, he looks sad or pissy. Managers have talked to him, and a report is going through HR right now, but I just hope he doesn't escalate. Despite being talked to, he still leaves the cart and stuff out for me with some water and rewrites my initials. Update: nothing's really seemed to happen with HR so far, except for him no longer waiting for me in the parking lot. I guess the manager talked with him about that. I told him to stop leaving work carts out for me, and he acted like I was being unreasonable. Then he wrote my initials on my work cart while I wasn't looking, as well as a smiley face, which it seemed he also drew on every window of my car the other day. He's fucking obsessed. This happened 18 years ago, before I had access to cell phone and internet. When I was 15, I'd walked from a hospital alone to a bus stop. I knew I had at least 15 minutes to wait and didn't look forward to it, when a man in his mid-30s started walking beside me. He was uncomfortably close, but I was young, and thanks to my upbringing, avoided conflict with adults like the plague. So I decided not to offend him and just bear with it, telling myself he's just walking in the same direction. And he was, but not to take the bus, as I had soon found out. Once at the bus stop, where we were all alone, the guy started talking to me, opening with questions about the bus schedule, which was on display behind him. I stayed rather passive in the conversation, only giving polite nods and a yes or no where it was expected. And he probably liked it, because he perked up and entered an almost manic-like state of happiness, talking about his life and job and everything. Gradually, he started talking about how he's unable to find a girlfriend and how he's watching his neighbors who slighted him and writing everything down to get them later. He had a good chuckle on that. The alarm went off in my head at that. I was very much used to my peers complaining about not being able to find a girlfriend, so I didn't think much about the incel stuff. The bus was now approaching, and it became clear I was going to board it, and he was not. He snatched my ticket before I got my wits about me, and I thought he was going to destroy it to prevent me from boarding, but no. He wrote his phone number on it and gave it back with an attitude of benevolent generosity. I boarded the bus and thought I had seen the last of him, but no. Weeks later, he boarded the same bus as me. He immediately approached me and casually asked me whether I was going to school. Having my backpack on me and not being used to lying, I said I am. He asked me,
"Are you going to university?"
I gave him an awkward look and said, "I'm 15. He seemed surprised, but not about my age. He thought he gave me a compliment because apparently being older is what every high school is craving. I got off the bus on the next stop because that's where my school was. He didn't follow me, and another passenger who overheard our conversation told me, "You shouldn't be talking to men like this." I didn't know what he meant, and he certainly was the same age as that one, so I just mumbled something, and off I went. A week later, the creep stood in front of my school, waiting for me, all dressed up. I had seen him before I walked out of the door, and a chill went down my spine. I didn't know what to do, so I fetched the school director, and I told him about my encounter. He went out and dealt with the man, and thankfully, he must have gotten the message, because I never met him again. Only years later, I understood he may have stalked me ever since the walk to the bus. Probably checked the schedule and wrote it for weeks to get another chance encounter, and then deducted where my school was. Most likely, he wanted to manipulate a child into a relationship, since he wasn't able to initiate one with an adult woman, and was convinced he was going to be successful. For some background info, at the time of this story, I was 13, and I'm also a female. It was around mid-March in Canada, so there was snow and slush everywhere. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, on to the story. I was walking to the store that's around a 5-minute walk from my house because I wanted chocolate and a drink. It was relatively warm that day, so I wore my spring coat and some sneakers, which now that I think about it, wasn't a very good idea considering the weather. As I walked to the store, I did my normal gaze around the place, just looking at everyone inside to see if I know anyone that's there or anything. Almost immediately, a balding man in a red tracksuit with white stripes, who looked to be in his early to mid-50s, caught my attention because he was looking at me already. While I was walking around, trying to decide what to get to drink, I felt like I was being watched, and I saw him about to leave the store, but still looking at me. I shook it off, thinking I was just being paranoid again. After he left, I quickly got what I wanted, paid for it, and left. When I got outside, I saw someone squatting next to the door with their hands in their pockets and their head down. After taking a second glance, I realized it was the guy from earlier. That raised a red flag for me, especially since he looked up partially before quickly putting his head back down when he saw me looking at him. After that, I started making my way home, but I felt like something was wrong because I've listened to enough true crime in my life to know that was a little fishy, to say the least. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing, but what I saw caught me off guard a little. The man was jogging after me and catching up quite quickly, so I made a break for it, bolting out of the parking lot as fast as I could, which, for the record, was really fast because I used to play forward in soccer. I made it out of the parking lot after almost slipping because of the slush, and I turned to see that he was still following me. I took no time to catch my breath before I started running like my life depended on it, which I thought it did. After another little bit of running, I turned around and saw him walking back into the parking lot as I made it to a bus stop that had multiple people at it. But I wasn't taking any chances, and I ran back home and told my mom, who slightly freaked out, but she was overall happy that I made it home safely. Who knows what would have happened if I never noticed him following me? I'm curious, but I'm glad I wasn't curious enough to stick around and find out what he wanted. This happened in August of 2013. I was visiting Montreal for their driver's site weekend, which was basically like Pride, but took place the long weekends before the official Montreal Pride. My best friend at the time had met a guy at Toronto Pride a month earlier, and he invited both of us to come there, so my friend wouldn't be uncomfortable going to spend the weekend with someone he didn't know well. We arrived on Thursday, and the trip was going great. We went out the first night, walked the streets that were closed off to cars the next day, and our host made us a nice dinner, and then we went out again Friday night. Just a quick note before I get into what happened. I partied quite a bit with drugs at this time, and I also in the past had a tendency to lose my cell phone. So for a year prior, I stopped taking my cell phone whenever I went out. So that Friday night, we went out to a club, Parking, which sadly has since closed, and it was another fun night. The music was great and the tequila shots were incredibly cheap. I was dancing and moving all around the club, but would circle back and check in with my friends and our host. I would also run into people that I knew who were also visiting from Toronto and ended up taking some MDMA from one of them. Danced some more until I was completely soaked in sweat. So I went to the bathroom to wipe myself down and pee. When I got into the bathroom, there was someone leaving, but it looked like I was the only one in there. I went and used the stall because I have a hard time using the urinal, and once I came out, I was quite surprised to see a man in the corner of the washroom, smiling at me. He looked in his mid-30s, on the shorter side, and a bit chubby. He was wearing a polo shirt and jeans, and had glasses, and I remember thinking when I saw, he reminded me of an accountant. Not sure why that thought popped in my head. I was pretty sure I didn't hear the door, but I couldn't be sure, so I just smiled back and said hello as I went to wash my hands.
Hello.
He responded.
Are you having fun tonight?
I replied I was, and that the music was incredible, and was wiping myself down with paper towels and my shirt.
Do you want to do some coke with me?
He asked. Now, this was not the first time I'd been offered coke in a bathroom at a nightclub, and I'd done this in the past, and ended up having some good experiences, and met some interesting people, so I was already high and drunk, and not thinking much of it, so I said sure, I would love to, thanks.
I just live right near here. It's at my place if you don't mind coming over. We can do some lines and have a drink, and then walk back to the club,
he replied. Now, obviously looking back, I realized how very dumb my following actions were, and I can't imagine myself being so stupid and careless now. But without thinking about it, I agreed, and I left with him. The club allowed you to re-enter if you had a wristband. We chatted on the walk over to his place. He asked me where I was from, because I didn't seem like I was from Montreal, and what parties I had gone to, and how old I was, and my name. I asked his name, but he instead responded that we had arrived. The whole walk felt like 5 minutes, but I honestly hadn't been paying much attention to where we were walking. His apartment was in this building that had 3 floors, and his unit was on the 2nd floor. You had to climb this long, narrow metal staircase, and his door seemed to be in the middle of 2 other apartments on either side. He unlocked the door and let me in first, flicked on the lights, and told me to make myself comfortable. I was walking, and I noticed he had carpet, so I turned around to ask him if I should take my shoes off, when I noticed that he was locking the door from the inside with a key above the regular lock. And in that moment, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of dread like I had never felt before. The danger I had possibly put myself in another city, no phone, nobody knows where I am. And now seeing this person locking their door from the inside with a key. I just thought to myself, I'll pretend I didn't see that. I won't take off my shoes and politely hang out for a few minutes, then ask to head back. I also thought I could be having an extreme overreaction to what I saw because I was high, but as I looked around, everything inside me was just screaming, "You need to get out of here." I went and sat on the arm of the couch. He said I should take off my shoes and relax. I was getting a better look at him now in the lights of his apartment. He still looked plain and unassuming, but his eyes looked shifty, and he pulled down both the shades on the windows that were on each side of the door. I told him that I was okay, and I was eager to get back to dancing, so he said he would make us drinks, then we could go back. The apartment looked much bigger inside than it did from the street. It was an open layout with the living room beside the kitchen, and then a hallway in the middle with the closed doors painted black, and I could hear music coming from one of the doors. I asked him if someone else was there, as he came from the kitchen with a glass, and he replied no. As he handed me my glass, he looked me up and down. I wasn't wearing a shirt. He he said, with this increasingly creepy smile spreading across his face.
You have a very beautiful body, especially your chest. Would you mind if I took some before photos of you before we went back?
Every alarm bell is going off in my head now, and all I can think about is Jeffrey Dahmer and all his Polaroids and what I'm going to do, because that was such a creepy thing to say, and all I can manage is a polite laugh as I take the drink and say sure.
Excellent,
he says. Then he tells me to take off my shoes, and he's gonna get the Coke and his camera, and to finish my drink. He walked down the hall, takes out his keys, and unlocks the second door, and opens the door enough to slip in and closes it behind him. The second that door was closed, I jumped up, ran over to the sink, and dumped my drink, put my shirt on, it had been tied around the belt loop of my shorts, and ran to the front door. I was able to turn and unlock the regular lock, but the door would not budge. I kept turning and pulling, but nothing. Then I heard from behind me.
What are you doing?
I turned around, and he was standing at the base of the hallway with one of those professional cameras slung around his neck and holding a square mirror with a pile of white powder on it. I thanked him for the drink, gesturing to my empty glass, but that it was getting late and I wanted to get back. But we could exchange numbers and maybe meet up tomorrow. His demeanor slightly changed. He was still smiling, but his tone, when he next spoke, sounded irritated. He asked me if I was nervous about taking the photos, and I should just wait for my drink to relax me, and I said no, that I wanted to go. This exchange of him telling me to stay and me saying no went back and forth for about a minute, when he suddenly glared at me, put down the mirror, pointed at the couch, and said,
Sit down, now.
Not knowing what to do or how I was going to get out of this, I remembered that there were other units on each side of us, and it had to be around 2:30 in the morning at this point. So I just started screaming at the top of my lungs like a madman, banging on the door, the window, the wall.
Shh, shut up, be quiet.
He snapped at me as he ran to the door. He quickly unlocked it and told me to get out and stepped aside. I bolted out that door and down the stairs, skipping the bottom steps, and hopped over the side of the railing. I looked up behind when I landed, and he wasn't there, but I heard a door slam and took off running down the street. I hadn't paid attention on the walk there, so I didn't know which way to walk, but I knew it was close. And luckily, I was able to wave down a passing taxi and take it back to the bar. When I got back to the bar, I found my friend in the same spot dancing. The whole incident must have been less than a half hour. I was too embarrassed about how stupid I had been, and being back in the club, I started to feel bad that I had just freaked out on this nice man, so I didn't say anything. But I stayed by his side until we left shortly after I got back. The entire thing felt quite surreal, and I remember the next day when I did tell my friend, kind of laughing it off and joking about getting murdered and trying to make light of it because it was so scary. And it wasn't until years later, after joining Reddit and this sub and reading other stories, that I started to think about that night more and more and realized how much potential danger I put myself in. So, strange man from the bathroom that lured me to his place and wanted to take before photos of me. Let's not meet ever again. Before I begin, I'm going to say that I'm a 19-year-old man and working a full-time job. I've since moved out of the place that this incident occurred in. What happened took place when I was about 6 years old. I lived in a decent neighborhood. We did have the occasional creepy person that would walk or bike by. We also had some apartment buildings where the people living there were heavy into drugs, but didn't bother anyone. They were nice people to talk to and frequently mentioned that they were into that stuff, but they never bothered me, so I didn't care. Now, enough with the background. The house I lived in at that point was a very decent size. My dad also built a garage, a huge garage. Now, this is where what happened. The garage was huge. It had enough space for 3 vehicles and rafters on the ceiling for storage of seasonal stuff, Halloween, Christmas, etc. This took place in December. I live in Atlantic Canada, and in Atlantic Canada, we get some pretty nasty snowstorms and blizzards. On a day in December, I was being a little kid in the snow, and my dad was working in the garage on one of his car projects. He had gotten thirsty and went in the house to get a drink. He came back out and asked if I had gone into the garage. I asked why, and he said there are footprints in the snow leading into the garage that he didn't think were his. I said no, and we both thought nothing of it. That evening, my dad and I went to bed early. My mom works late and came home late that night and saw some of my toys that were in the rafters stored away were on the garage floor. She thought nothing of it, moved them, and parked the vehicle in the garage, closed the garage door, went into the house, watched some TV, and went to bed. Now, my dad wakes up at 4 a.m. every morning to be at work for 5. The garage door was opened when my dad woke up, so naturally, he was angry. He wakes everyone up and goes out to the garage, comes back in, and is freaking out about a lot of very expensive equipment was missing. We called the cops. The outside lights were flicked on, and we saw those same mysterious footprints leading to the garage earlier, leading to the backyard, and into the forestry behind my house. The cops searched the garage, and my mom brought up the toys falling from the rafters. The cops asked to borrow a ladder and went up to check. They found a gun, a meat cleaver, 3 condoms, 2 of which were used, assuming he masturbated into them. I did not sleep for a week. I was terrified. They caught the guy 2 weeks later trying to sell all of my dad's equipment at a pawn shop. He confessed to everything. He said he broke into other houses on our street. He also stated he watched our house for a whole month to learn all of our routines so he wouldn't get caught. He had the weapons in case he did. He said he jerked off into the condoms when he saw my mom. He is currently serving a 15-year prison sentence. I don't want to know what would have happened if my mom, dad, or I had saw him. First, let me start off with some background. I've been going to the gym for about 6 years consistently, every single day, and mostly in the evenings around 8 or 9 p.m., and my workouts usually last until 10 or 11 p.m. Around summer of 2018, I switched to LA Fitness, which is a really big health club chain. I'd been going there for about 6 months when an older man, around his 30s, early 40s, I say old because I was 18 at the time, and that seemed old to me, began to approach me nearly every single time I was at the gym. He was Hispanic, shorter, around 5'8", and I believe he told me his name, I forgot it, as well as how old he was, which I also forgot. Now, keep in mind, I'm an 18-year-old 5'2" female, so in the beginning, I took his attentions to be friendly, and I was friendly back to him, but I tried to end conversations quickly because he liked to chat for a long time, and I just wanted to get my workouts done. In the beginning, when he first started approaching me, he would tell me how he thought I was very beautiful, that he would love to take me out for drinks, etc. He asked me for my name and how old I was, which I told him because I thought that was innocent enough. He also told me he had a young daughter with his ex, whom he described as psycho, and he told me he would love for me to meet his daughter. Obviously, I brushed all of these invites off, and eventually, I began to get really annoyed. I would dread showing up to the gym because I didn't want to be approached by him. One day, after about a year of him approaching me nearly every day, regardless of me changing my times of going to the gym, he would spend hours there. An older gentleman who was exercising on a bike behind me noticed this man come up to me. By this time, I had been ignoring the creepy guy every single time he approached me for several weeks, pretending to focus extra hard on my workout and listening to my music. He stood next to me and began speaking, calling my name, trying to get my attention, but I just kept ignoring. After a few minutes, I guess he started feeling awkward and walked away. The gentleman behind me got my attention and told me that he had seen the guy talking to me several times and even watching me work out from a distance every time I was at the gym, and that I should report him and straight up just tell him to leave me alone because what he was doing was harassment. I told him thank you and just decided to brush it off as him just being an extra creepy guy. The next time he tried to approach me, I told him to leave me alone, that I had a boyfriend, and that I was not interested. After that, he left me alone. Occasionally, I would work out with one of my friends, who told me that she noticed a strange, older Hispanic man watching me work out at the gym, but I just brushed that off too. I know I sound really stupid. I truly thought he wasn't a threat though. Flash forward, December of 2019. I was nearing the end of my workout. It was 11 p.m. when I noticed him at the gym. I didn't think he had spotted me yet, so as soon as I saw him, I decided to cut my workout short and began walking to the front doors of the gym. I had one headphone in and one out, just in case. The gym was relatively empty by that time, and so I was a little nervous to walk alone to my car in the dark, even though I had parked close to the entrance. As I was about to reach the doors, I hear him calling my name.
Stephanie, Stephanie.
I immediately began to panic, and I started walking faster. He, I shit you not, started tapping my back and gripped my arm, still saying my name. By this point, some people in the gym had started to pay attention, and I briefly turned to him and yanked my arm away. I ran out of the gym to my car, locked the doors, and left. He had never done anything like that before, so I was shaken by it. By the time I went to work out again the next day, around 8 p.m., I had talked myself out of being scared and decided I would just keep my eyes open and be extra cautious of him if he showed up. I was working out by the dumbbell area on the far end of the gym, where the benches are and a mirror spanning the whole wall. Machines and workout equipment were behind me, and through the mirror, I could see everything going on. I see him enter and walk to a machine a few feet behind me, and so I began hurrying my workout. I finish a set of an exercise I'm doing, and I look up in the mirror to see what he's doing, and see him smiling at me from his machine into the mirror. I get immediate goosebumps and begin to put all of my equipment away. I avoid looking in his direction or the mirror at all. When I come back to pick up my water bottle, which I had left on the bench I was working out on, I briefly notice someone sitting on the bench next to mine. I look in the mirror to scan my surroundings again, and right next to me is him, again, staring at me in the mirror. Extremely on edge and nervous by this point, I immediately leave, asking one of the front desk attendants to walk me to my car. I got into my car, locked the doors, and called my boyfriend to tell him what had happened. After 10 minutes of talking in the parking lot, I noticed the big truck directly across from me turn on and turn their brights on straight in my face. I thought it was strange, so I squinted into the light to see who might be in there. It was just the outline of a smaller man. I quickly realized it must have been the guy from the gym, and so I booked it out of there, checking my mirrors to see if anyone was following me. By that time, I was shaking, and I noticed the truck pulling out of the parking lot and driving behind me. I still couldn't clearly make out who it was, but I was freaking out. I drove almost all the way home with the same truck still behind me. I quickly realized I couldn't literally just lead him to my house, because out of all the stupid things I had done so far, that would be the stupidest. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot that was lit and really populated and waited to see what he would do. He kept driving past me, and I waited 20 minutes before driving home, making sure I was not being followed. After all of that, you would think I would just change gyms and call the police. Well, no. 18-year-old me still denied that it 100% was him or that anything would happen to me. The rest of that week, I had no encounters with him, and so the incident began to leave my mind. The next Tuesday, it was January 2020 now, I was at the gym once again, and around 11 p.m. I had finished my workout and was about to leave. I hadn't really paid attention to whether the guy was there or not, and I scanned the gym once before leaving, but didn't see anything. I headed to my car, got in, forgot to lock the doors, and sat there texting my boyfriend, asking when he could call. We were long distance at that time, so we usually called at night. All of a sudden, someone starts knocking on my window. I jump slightly and look out my window, and it is him. He starts calling my name, and I see him reaching down to the door handle. Somehow, in those few moments, I remembered I hadn't locked my doors, and I immediately hit the lock button. The smile that formed on his face is one I will never, ever forget. He looked almost smug, like he knew that even that wouldn't help me. He began banging on my window and telling me to unlock and open the door repeatedly. Eventually, he moved to pulling on the door handle. In retrospect, I realized my first instinct should have been to call the police, but in that moment, I decided to call my boyfriend. My phone instantly hooked up to my car's Bluetooth, and it started to ring very loudly, even on the outside. I think that's really what saved me. As soon as he heard the ringing, I assume he believed I was calling the police, and he immediately ran away and got into the car one over from mine. He pulled out, and it was the same big truck that had been shining its headlights at me and had followed me almost all the way home a week before. I was shaking with fear and talking to my boyfriend, explaining what had happened, and I also called my mom and told her what had happened. I don't know why, but I never called the police to report it, mostly because I wasn't sure that they would believe me or that I had any evidence to back me up. But I have since then changed gyms, gotten a taser, I work out only during the day, and I look over my shoulder every single time I'm somewhere alone. I still wonder what would have happened that night if I hadn't remembered my doors were unlocked. He could have been a rapist, kidnapper, serial killer, anything, even just a desperate man. Either way, we are gym dude. Let's not meet. When I was younger, 17, I lived in a small village of 1,200 people. Usually every year, there is a local town festival, and all the adults go for dinner and party at the town hall, where they perform some acting and make fun of the year that just passed. Usually this is in February, so it's snowy and dark pretty early. When this festival is, there are absolutely all 13 to 17-year-old girls booked for babysitting. Me and my two friends went for a drive around the town, since you have to be 18 to go to the party. So we just drove around, giving people lifts to the party to earn some extra cash. Since there's no taxi in this town, that was a great way to get some extra pocket money. We had been driving for a couple of hours, and of course, we knew where everyone lived, and some of the adults asked us to drive past their house to make sure everything was all right, and give the parents some extra comfort. I think it was also to give us some tasking until the party was over, so they could get a lift home. In one of the older neighborhoods in the town, there were low floodlights, so we just drove slowly, and one mom, who we gave a lift to earlier, lived there. She was a widow with 3 young children, 2, 4, and 8, if I recall correctly, and her niece, 15, was babysitting. The time was around 10 p.m., and when we drove in this neighborhood, which is surrounded by hills and some cliffs, my friend swore that he saw someone move in her garden. We thought little of it and just said it was probably a cat or something. We kept driving to the other end of the town, but my friend in the back seat said that he had a bad feeling and wanted to drive back to her house and check if we could see some footprints in the snow. When we got back there, we parked the car and looked over the fence, and there were fairly new human footprints in the snow, adult size. So we all looked at each other and decided to follow the trail. The trail went past all the bedrooms, but near every window, the footprint turned to the window, like someone was trying to peek in. Eventually, the trail ended on the street, and we lost it where the snowplow had been earlier in the night. We chatted if we should go get the mom from the party or ring the doorbell to check if everything was all right, since none of the tracks led to the back door or the front door. We decided that the two of us would stay in the neighborhood hidden and monitor the house, and the driver would drive to the police station and pick up the mom on the way back. That was a good call. Maybe 5 minutes after he left, we saw someone lurking behind one of the garages a couple houses down. He wasn't moving, just sat there with a cigarette. We monitored from a distance since he couldn't see us. Then he stood up, looked around, and started to creep to the house where the mom lived, and he walked to the back door. Without thinking, me and my friends ran through the 2 gardens that were between where we were and the mom's house was, so we would catch him trying to enter the back door. We arrived just in time that he was trying to open the door when we shouted at him, "What the fuck are you doing?" He made a run for it, and we followed. He ran down the street to get some speed ahead of us, but we were both athletes, so we were gaining on him. This was the most intense moment of our life. I remember the only thing I was thinking was to not slip and lose momentum. The end of the street was approaching, and the next turn would be 90 degrees to the right. So instead of slowing down, I jumped off the street so I could intercept him after he would lose speed by taking the turn. My calculation was wrong, and he managed to take the turn without losing much speed. I spent too much energy sprinting in a foot of deep snow, and I knew it was slowing me down. I was still about 10 meters behind him, but my friend was closer and gaining on him. When my friend realized he could kick his feet and trip him, he did. He fell, and this was the quickest takedown ever. We smashed his head to the frozen ground, and he was out. While we were catching our breath, he didn't move. We rolled him over on his back, and he was breathing, but really shallow with a cracking noise. I was terrified. Millions of questions came to my head. Is he dying? What if this was just some relative making a prank? Why did we chase him? Meanwhile, my friend checked his pockets, and there was lubricant for adultery, strong sedatives, and a broken camera. Luckily, the driver came a couple of minutes after with the mom and the police. Then the ambulance arrived and took him away. The day after, we were brought in for questioning in the police station, and the chief told us that he was a known pedophile, not from our town. And we for sure saved the day, and probably more kids, since the tumble he took when he fell gave him bleeding in the brain, and he's not able to wipe his own ass anymore. We told him the story, and when my friend said he tripped him, the chief stopped typing and said, "Are you sure you tripped him? The way I see it, you 3 heroes caught a burglar in the act, and when he was running away, he fell and hit his head." He looked at us and nodded with a soft smile. Thinking back, this perv must have planned this, knowing when the festival was, knowing that she was a single mom, picking out the house, knowing that gives me the creeps. I'm not sure how scary this is to you guys, because the initial encounter wasn't that scary. It was what happened after. I was walking down my street because I needed something from the store that was not that far away. It was daylight, and there were plenty of people around. So, as I'm walking, I see this guy that I have seen before around my house. He doesn't live on my street, but he used to have a girlfriend that lives just a couple of houses from me. They dated for a long time, but at this point, they were broken up for almost as much time. For some context, this man is over 10 years older than me. I usually always say hello, as it is something we do in my country a lot, especially in your neighborhood. Before I could even say anything, he raised his hand for me to do a high five with him. I did the high five, and I lowered my hand, only he wasn't letting go. He gently held my hand while speaking to me. The conversation went like this. Creep.
Hey, sweetie, how have you been?
Me. I'm pretty good. How are you? He started staring at my body, which is making me feel weird, so I say the first thing that comes to mind. Me. I'm covered in dog hair. My dog is shedding right now. Creep.
You look amazing, like really, really good.
He says this with such a creepy smile, and he looks me up and down a couple of times. He still is holding my hand. I was so uncomfortable that I just said my friend is waiting for me and left. Me and my friend would joke around about him being a creep after I told her the story. It was funny until a couple of months later when his initials were all over the news. He tried to R-word an underage girl, and when I say underage, I mean not even a teenager yet. He threatened her with a knife and even cut her many times over her body. Thankfully, he wasn't successful in getting away with her because she ran away and asked someone to call the police right away. He's in jail right now, but I still remember his creepy smile and the gentle yet disturbing touch. I hope he never sees the sunlight again. This story happened when I was in college. There was something about my early years in college that just seemed to bring on a slew of experiences that ranged from creepy to terrifying. I don't know what it was about that time in my life. This experience was somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Anyway, one night at the beginning of summer, following my freshman year of college, some of my high school friends and I were going to a party. We hadn't seen a ton of each other in the preceding year because of us all being away at college, mostly just during school breaks and a few random weekends here and there. So we were all feeling kind of giddy at having the whole summer together. I wouldn't have normally gone to this party, hosted by someone else we went to high school with, but they all wanted to go, and I wanted to hang out with them, so I agreed. That is not the mistake I made in this story. That would come later that night. We got to the party, and we realized it was almost exclusively people from high school, which was kind of nice, actually. It was like a big reunion. Soon, my prior inhibitions were gone, and that was only partially because I started throwing back screwdrivers the moment I got there. A couple of hours later, I was more than a little tipsy. No, I was full-on drunk, though not totally plastered yet, which would prove to be my saving grace in this story. After a while, a group of my friends decided to split off. The host of this party, Stephanie, lived in her parents' house still, and it was in the middle of nowhere basically, near a forest. Forests at night both scare and enthrall me, so drunk me suggested that we go exploring. This is something my friends would not let me live down, like not ever. So anyway, this group, Lauren, Hillary, Jared, Alex, Hugo, Dean, and hostess Stephanie, plus myself obviously, decided to go on a midnight walk through the woods. It was pretty creepy, not gonna lie, but in a cool way. At least I thought so. A couple of people in the group, mainly Hillary and Alex, were pretty afraid. But Hillary went because her best friend was Lauren, and Alex had a thing for Hillary and Lauren, which was the whole thing and not the point of the story. But because of that, they both were there. They kept making comments about how creeped out they were, and I kept telling them to relax. No one else is out here, I told them. Let's just enjoy this time together. Being drunk makes me weirdly sentimental, okay? We walked through the forest for a bit, and then we came into this clearing with a lake and dock and tall grass and shit, plus a shed and what turned out to be a boathouse, both of which had seen better days. Now, Stephanie and I weren't exceedingly close, so this was my first time exploring this forest, but Dean and Hugo had before and remembered this place. They mentioned that they thought Stephanie's parents forbid them from going back there because it wasn't their property, which was true. It was like suddenly Stephanie realized where we were. I wasn't the only drunk one, okay? And her eyes got super wide, and she looked nervous. Not scared exactly, more like worried we'd get in trouble, and she said we should go back. I told her that everything was fine, since you can't totally trust the judgment of a drunk person, and because everybody else was drunk. They all agreed with me, save for Steph, but she was outnumbered and not about to go back alone. Even Hillary and Alex were okay with staying, and because logic is a friend to drunk people everywhere, I suggested we play hide and seek, and most everyone agreed. Honestly, I don't know why people kept listening to me. Now, if I'd been sober, this is the kind of place I'd be kind of freaked out about. In a cool way, sure, but not in a let's play hide and seek kind of way. This is where things go wrong. Hugo was forced to be it because we were assholes and told him he didn't have a choice, so he went into the woods and counted while we all ran to hide. I saw Dean dart into the shed, but everyone else ran into the woods. I decided to duck down in the tall grass, which varied in height. Sometimes I could kneel, and sometimes I had to be on my stomach to be totally concealed. As I was hiding, I heard voices from the trees nearby, whispers, like the speakers were trying not to be heard. I was curious, so I made my way towards the voices, first on my hands and knees, and then eventually army crawling as the grass got shorter. I nearly shit my pants when I ran into Stephanie in the grass, who turned out to be doing the exact same thing as me. When we got closer, we realized that it was Lauren and Jared, and that was how Steph and I realized they liked each other. We were listening to them flirt and looking at each other hopefully, and I swear we had a telepathic conversation about how good they'd be together. But that was when we heard someone barreling towards us through the grass. Heart pounding, I turned to see who it was, just as Hugo threw himself down next to Stephanie and me, and he looked terrified. "Hugo, what the fuck?" I whisper hissed, because there was no way he'd counted as high as we were making him. We were being real jerks to Hugo that night. Sorry, man. He first looked around frantically, and then he told us what had him spooked. I'll never forget this because of the sheer terror I saw on Hugo's face and heard in his voice. "There's someone in the woods," he told us. Stephanie tried to tell him that it was probably someone else from the party, but Hugo said no. He'd seen the guy and hid behind a tree, and this guy seemed to be in his 40s, Hugo explained. And he said that this guy looked rough, too, and he just had a bad feeling, so he booked it. It was just chance that he found Stephanie and me. "He's looking for something, or someone," Hugo said, telling us that the guy was shining a flashlight around. As if on cue, someone came walking out of the woods, and then he called out,
Jim, are you out there?
He sounded kind of angry, and now I felt stone cold sober. This wasn't right, and it was about to get worse, because that's when we saw the shadow of someone rowing a boat down the lake towards the dock. The first guy walked onto the dock to meet this guy, Jim presumably, and I heard him demand,
Where is he?
The first guy sounded angry, like he was expecting another person to be there too, and the second guy, Jim, informed the first.
I fucked up.
They proceeded to argue, though I couldn't hear what they were saying, and then they went into the boathouse. I was pretty sure that no one had hidden in there, but I was worried about that, plus the fact that two shifty guys were doing what seemed to be pretty shifty things. We needed to get out of there, I knew that, but Dean was still in the shed, which was too close to the boathouse for comfort, given the situation. Lauren and Jared were now making out, and totally oblivious, and Hillary and Alex were fuck knows where. Why had I suggested hide and seek? That was what I kept asking myself while I tried to formulate a plan. Then we heard someone running through the woods, but like they were trying to do so quietly, and I turned to see Hillary. It looked like she was trying to find somewhere else to hide, unaware of what was happening, and I saw her run towards the boathouse. It was like time stopped, and I didn't know what to do, how to stop her. Honestly, I froze. But then Hillary hesitated when she got to the door. She would later tell us that the voices she heard inside gave her pause, thank Jesus. And then the door swung open. It was like something out of a movie. Hillary was now hiding behind the open door, and the first guy stood in the doorway looking around. I think he must have heard Hillary, who was not being nearly as quiet as she thought she was. If he closed that door from the outside, he'd see Hillary, and then we'd be well and truly fucked. Luckily, he went back inside and closed the door. We had to get the hell out of there, but we still had to go get Dean, Lauren, and Jared and find Alex. We didn't have a lot of time, I didn't think, so we had to be fast. And then suddenly, Hugo stood up, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed, "Caw-caw! Caw-caw!" He apparently thought we were in a movie. I just looked at him with a, "What the fuck, Hugo?" expression on my face. It was not what I would have done, but I'll be damned, it worked. Hillary came sprinting towards us, as did Alex, who had been hiding behind the boathouse. Likewise, Dean emerged from the shed, and Lauren and Jared detached themselves from each other. Alas, the two men in the boathouse heard us too and came busting out, but by that point, we were all sprinting away. I swear, I've never before, nor since, run that fast. At one point, Stephanie tripped, and I practically ripped her arm out of her socket while pulling her to her feet. Sorry, Steph. The guys chased us for a bit at least, though I don't know for how long, because we just kept running until we got back to Stephanie's house. The party was still going, and the men hadn't followed us beyond the woods, but we were too freaked out to stay. I called my brother to come pick us up, and we all left. Even Stephanie, who left her house unattended, save for the drunk partygoers. We spent the night at my brother's house that night, and then we went back to Steph's house to help clean up the next day, because honestly, this experience kind of bonded us in a weird way. Lauren and Jared are now married. Hillary and Alex were both in the wedding. Alex briefly mentioned this incident in his speech. I lived with Dean for a bit following college, and Hugo is one of my best friends, as is Stephanie, which is weird because we weren't really friends before that. But I swear, we thought we were going to die that night, all of us, except maybe Lauren and Jared. Even Dean heard what was happening outside the shed and was waiting for the right time to make his escape. You can't go through something like that and not come out closer. It's strange, but also kind of nice. Like we have this shared history, which was true before this because of going to school together, but it's different now. I wanted to go back to investigate in the light of day, but only Dean wanted to go with me, but I thought maybe that wasn't enough people. I was still pretty spooked, though intrigued. Stephanie told us later, though, that she told her dad when her parents got home later that day, and he and a few of his friends went back there and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. They moved shortly thereafter, not because of this, so we never found out what happened, but we've also never forgotten it. It's the mid-90s in rural Ohio. Children are free range, smartphones are non-existent, and I'm a quiet, shy 4th grader. That summer, my mom became good friends with a couple who owned a large, beautiful flower farm. Most weekends, they would host friends and families for bonfires and s'mores. The adults would drink grown-up beverages, and the kids would explore and play. On the particular evening of this encounter, we had just settled in beside the fire when my mom stiffened beside me. She turned to me and said, "I don't want you and your brother wandering off. Just play here where I can see you." Now, this was unusual and kind of a bummer to my kid self, but she was regularly so lenient that I begrudgingly went along with it. After our s'mores were eaten and before the sugar rush ensued, my mom gathered us together to wash our hands. Once again, this seemed odd. I was completely capable of using the restroom on my own, as was my younger brother. As we were rounding the corner to the house, we passed a man we had not previously met. My mother grabs both of our hands tightly and speed walks us to the back door, closing the screen door and locking the glass door behind her. In my memory, she was composed, but she later told me she felt breathless and panicked, like a wide-eyed animal. Not long after, we hit the road to get home for bed and church the next morning. I remember thinking, I wish we could stay and play longer, or even camp there overnight like we sometimes did, but oh well. My child mind didn't connect anything odd about the whole situation. It would be many years later, when I was an adult, that my mother would tell me a story I will never forget. She remembers all the same details: the bonfire, the s'mores, the sugared-up kiddos, and the sticky marshmallow hands. But she also clearly remembers the sudden feeling of inescapable dread in the pit of her stomach and the hackles rising on the back of her neck. Even in front of the bonfire, her blood ran icy cold. She told me all she could think was, "It's time to go. We need to get out of here." She said it was the most persistent feeling of urgency she's ever felt. She told me that the next day at church, she asked her friend who the new man was at their home that night. He replied, "That's my brother. He just got released from prison for child molestation and assault. He and I have never gotten along, but he has nowhere else to go. I asked him to go somewhere else for the evening, but he just showed back up at the house with no warning. I would never have allowed him near children." Her jaw almost dropped to the floor. She told me that before she had even seen him on the way back to the house, she felt his presence. She kept looking into the darkness beside the house and feeling like she was being watched. She knew instinctively her children were in harm's way and she needed to get us somewhere else. She didn't question it or blow it off. She listened to her gut, and I'm thankful she did. The feelings she experienced that night were so intense, we never went back to their home again. Friends, please, always listen to your instincts and be safe out there. This happened on a backwoods creepy highway road, somewhere between Georgia and Florida in the 80s. My family has always been a Midwestern road trip family, since Dad does not like flying. When I was a preteen, we took one of many road trips to Florida, and Mom and Dad would both drive for the entire 24 hours, just to stop and eat and take breaks. I've always been a light road sleeper and wake up for anything. The reason why this story sticks with me so well is that it's one of the only times I've seen both of my parents show signs of being scared, something as a kid I never really saw. In the middle of the night, I remember waking up to my parents talking about something in a concerning tone. The windows were open, since we were far enough south now to be out of crappy November Midwest weather. Once I wake up, they both stop talking, so I sit up, thinking that they were arguing or something, and that I stopped it. I look out the window and see nothing, just like trees and fields, the moon and electrical poles, but nothing. No houses, no other cars, nothing. I ask where we are, and my mom actually says, "I don't know." So now I'm really like, WTF? I say, "Are we lost?" And they both just say nothing. And then I hear music, like our car radio playing, but it's coming from outside. Just loud enough, like it's the car next to us, but we are the only car on the road. But not loud enough to make out the exact song. It's just music. And my parents are listening to it too, all quiet. So I say, "Where's that music coming from?" And there is a pause, and my mom finally says, "I don't know." So I say, "Is it our radio?" And my mom says no. And then suddenly, my dad says, very, very calmly, "Wife, roll up your window." And my mom practically has a heart attack getting the window rolled up. I went back to sleep somehow, but I had no idea what was happening, and my dad drove faster. On the same trip, we saw a couple with a trailer hitching up a car behind them, but it was hitched up in a way that it looked like an invisible person was driving. My parents thought that was so hilarious, and then redirected any mention of the phantom music to that part of my trip. So I've never fully gotten 100% of the true story. I was hiking in the Catskills. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I come to the Catskills fairly regularly throughout the year because sometimes the Poconos just gets a little boring. I started at the trailhead parking lot where I parked my car and began walking up the same trail that I've walked up 1,000 times. After about an hour, I started to feel kind of weird. I felt like the woods were a little bit quieter than they usually were when I had come up here before, but I wasn't initially very concerned about it. After I sat down to have breakfast, I started hearing rustling above me, and some sticks fell down right beside me. I wasn't really worried about this either, as I just assumed it was some squirrels running around, or some chipmunks throwing things at me. This has happened to me before. I finished my breakfast without incident and kept walking around the summit. This was fairly early in the morning, around 6 a.m., so I would think there would be a lot of birds chirping and a lot of other activity, but things just kept getting quieter and quieter as I ascended. This definitely creeped me out, but I tried to push it out of my mind because I've already been hiking for a while at this point, and I'm definitely not turning around. Eventually, more sticks fell to my right, somewhat close to me, and they sounded heavier. These were not the kind of small twigs that would generally fall from squirrel activity. I went over and checked them, and these were fairly substantial. This continued to happen in a higher frequency until I finally reached the end of the trail. On my way back, it happened continuously, increasing in frequency as I descended, until suddenly it just kind of stopped when I was about a mile from the car. When I finally returned to my car, I found all of the doors open, and it seemed like a lot of my stuff had been very violently rummaged through. I had a bag in there with some of my clothes in it, and this had been torn up. A lot of my clothes were outside of the car, leading back into the woods. I thought about calling the police, but I live in Philadelphia, so I knew there wasn't really anything that was going to happen. To this day, I still get freaked out when I think about it. I don't necessarily think it was connected, but I do feel really uneasy about both of these things happening at the same time. Then again, maybe I was just robbed. So I used to work as a security officer. I was asked to work a Saturday night shift at an old warehouse in Dudley. I turned up at 5 p.m. where the building was a huge brick warehouse with some makeshift offices at the front. I walked in, took the keys from the day officer, and locked the doors behind him. Everything seemed normal for a while. It was a bit creepy as the building was so old, but I was used to that. Around 1 a.m., I got a call from the warehouse manager. One of his night drivers had forgotten his paperwork and asked me to go to the office right at the back of the warehouse and collect it for him so he can come pick it up. I said fine and headed to the office. The warehouse was pitch black. I had a small torch, but it only slightly lit my way. I walked through until I got to the office door, which was a huge metal sliding door. It made a screeching noise as I pulled it open. As I walked in front of me was the office fax machine, which was blinking, and the paperwork was printed out. I grabbed the paperwork, but as soon as I turned around, I looked to the other end of the office and saw what I can only describe as a dark figure, hunched over, shivering. I could hear what sounded like breathing, but like if you were freezing cold. I stood there for about 30 seconds, motionless, staring at this figure. I turned back slowly and closed the door behind me, rushing back to the front office where I locked the door and waited for the driver. An hour later, the driver collected his paperwork, and for the rest of the night, I convinced myself it was just the dark playing tricks with me, but didn't stop me from unlocking the office door or checking the cameras every few minutes. 5 a.m. turned up and I got a knock on the door from the day officer. I handed him the keys and expected him to come in, but he locked the door from the outside. I asked him if he was going in, and he said he doesn't go inside when there's nobody else in, but sits in his car in the car park and waits. I said that's a bit strange. He looked at me and asked if I went anywhere else other than the security office. I told him that I went to the back office to get paperwork for a driver, not telling him about the other part. I'll never forget the look he gave me, or what he said then. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Well then, you know why I don't go in there alone then." It gave me chills, but I shrugged it off and just said, "Okay then," and left for home. Safe to say, on the way home, I called my office and requested not to go back there. This is 100% a true story. Back in 2021, my family took a trip to Lake Sanitla in North Carolina, a beautiful lake that's rich in Native American history and surrounded by mountain trails. We decided to go on one of these trails on an overcast day. I'm not an athletic person, and I suffer from asthma, so I was behind the rest of my family by myself. About almost halfway through the hike, I heard my sister yell my birth name, but it sounded like it was off the trail. She never calls me by my real name, just my nickname I've had since I was a baby. It did sound like she was scared, so I was very tempted to run off and find her, but I knew my sister wasn't stupid. She wouldn't go off the trail, even in case of an emergency. I quickly caught up to the rest of my family, and my sister was there with them, resting on some rocks next to a waterfall, chatting away and taking pictures. I asked my sister if she had called my name. She didn't know what I was talking about. She had been talking to our dad the whole time. I don't know what called my name that day, but I'm glad I didn't listen to it. Who knows what would have happened to me? I haven't been to that trail since this encounter. I don't have a clue what called my name. If you're educated on Appalachian folklore, please give me some insight on what happened to me. When I was 13 to 14, me and my friends would sneak out and go hang out with our boyfriends out in the middle of nowhere. We lived basically in the middle of nowhere, so going to random back roads was pretty much our only option for having fun. We would go to this place the locals called the tunnel. It was just a dirt road with tall trees and overgrown willows on both sides. It was very secluded, so we would go there to drink beer, smoke weed, and make out with our boyfriends. They would always tell us spooky stories of a large black dog that would chase their car every time they went down there at night. They said one time that they went there during the day and saw the dog dead and mangled on the side of the road. The next time they went back at night, the black dog was alive and well and chasing after their car again. I knew they were just telling us these stories to scare us, and I wasn't sure if I really believed them, since I had come down to this place with them a few times, and I'd never seen the black dog. One night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, we were sitting in our friend's car in the tunnel. We had all been drinking and smoking weed. We were all joking and laughing, when suddenly the driver whispers, "What is that up there?" I looked, and I didn't see anything, so I replied, "There's nothing up there. Your eyes are just playing tricks on you." "No, seriously, there's something in the road up there," he replies. The guy sitting in the passenger seat agrees and said that he sees something too. The driver puts the car in drive and starts slowly rolling forward, and a figure emerges from the dark. A man in shorts is standing in the middle of the road, watching us drive towards him. This is a dirt road in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning on a very cold fall night. And this man is standing in the road wearing nothing but shorts, not even shoes on, just shorts. "What the fuck is he doing?" the driver says as he pushes on the brakes and stops the car. We all stare for a moment at this man just staring at us. His eyes were glowing like deer's eyes do in headlights. I've never seen a person's eyes glow like that before. We all started freaking out, and then the driver says, "Fuck this," and starts driving forward. Fast. The man just keeps staring at us until we get about 10 feet away, and then he just calmly walks to the side of the road and vanishes. There was nowhere for him to go. There was 6-foot-tall fences with willows overgrown over the fence, making the barrier at least 10 feet tall. No human man could have cleared all of that. I still can't explain it to this day. This story happened back in December in Ireland, and it's one of my more solid paranormal stories, so I thought I'd share. It's also a lot less distressing to me since it wasn't my house. I was just on vacation. I'm American. In December, the first half of our trip, me and my mom were in Dublin, and the second half, we were in the country of Killarney. We were near several haunted attractions, and it was all very cool. I didn't get bad vibes from any of it, to be honest. The house did feel eerie. It was a historical country home with historical furniture, and it was on the property of another family. I was already creeped out by the house, but the house itself and the land were so beautiful I didn't really care. It was the second to last day, and we had just toured some haunted castle and graveyard that is right across the road from us. We go to sleep, and around 1 to 2 a.m., I'm woken up by a very loud doorbell. I'm extremely scared at this point because I think it's a stranger outside of the house. And also, my mom would get high and smoke cigarettes out there and forget to lock the door sometimes, so I wasn't sure if it was locked. I don't move for about 5 minutes and just listen to see if I can hear anybody outside or inside. I hear nothing, so I text my mom that somebody rang the bell, get up, lock my door, and wait another 20 minutes. After 20 minutes of not hearing anything, I get up and make sure all of the doors and windows are locked. They all were, and I peek my head out, see nobody there, and go back to sleep. I wake up later to my mom, and I tell her what happened. She's also super creeped out because she thinks that we're gonna get murdered out here. I'm trying to describe the sound of it to her, but realize I can't because it was a very unique, resounding bell that sounded like it was coming from all directions inside the house. I go outside so I can hit the bell and show her, and we find out there is no doorbell. We search the whole property for one, and there isn't. Next, I'm thinking, maybe it was a doorbell from the family's house somehow. So I hit their doorbell, and it's very faint, and definitely not the same. This whole time, we see nobody there, except for their creepy-ass Victorian furniture, dining table, always set for nobody. The next day, we get home pretty late from our hike. We look inside. It's hard not to. This wall was half window, and some creepy-ass person was just sitting there in the dark on their Victorian couch. No TV or nothing, just next to their set dining table. We are both paranormal sus, and I start looking up stories about the doorbell. All I find is that everybody says, whatever you do, don't open the door because that invites it in. I tell her this, and we go to sleep that night. I wake up around 3 to 4 a.m. because that was our last night, and I need to pack for the airport. I'm downstairs making coffee when I hear her shout out, "Megan, was that you?" And I shout, "No, what do you mean?" from below. Later, she tells me that she was woken up at that time from very loud knocks to her door. I was right downstairs and would have heard this. Because of what I said, she didn't open the door and waited another hour before coming out. I asked if maybe I made too much noise with the coffee maker, and she says no. It was very clearly 3 knocks on her door. So what do you think? I searched all day at the airport that day, and I found nothing on this. Did that mean that something wanted in? Was it waiting outside of our doors? What the actual fuck was it? I tried to pressure her into messaging the owner and asking about the paranormal history of the house, but she refused, and I couldn't find anything. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Now, I don't know a ton about the history of my childhood home, but I know that it was old as hell and one of the creepiest places I've ever lived in. It was a 4-story house, fancy, right? With lots of dark spaces and long stairways. Basically, it was really big. There wasn't a moment in that house that I felt like I was truly alone, and there wasn't a hallway that felt truly empty. I was just barely out of toddlerhood when I started to develop severe anxiety. I was afraid to do anything alone. I was always checking behind me, sleeping with my head under the covers, seeing things, hearing things, you name it. I'm almost 100% sure that there was something paranormal making me feel that way. I wasn't the only one seeing and hearing things, though. My older brother shared a room with me, and he always slept on the top bunk. His bed was maybe a foot away from the ceiling, and the attic was right above us. He told me that some nights he'd hear adult footsteps right above his head, just circling the attic. But it gets weirder. He told me that at one point he woke up next to a shadowy figure just lying in bed with him. He claims the figure had 2 white specks for eyes, and that it wasn't acting malicious, just lying there silently. This might have been some kind of sleep paralysis hallucination, but considering the other events, I wouldn't be surprised if it was some kind of spirit. And now, onto the worst one, the playroom. That room was the creepiest fucking thing in the house, and I get shivers just thinking about it. It sat at the end of a long hallway on the top floor, just below the attic. My room was down the hall from it, and it was always pitch black. I remember staying up at night staring at it, just in case something moved. I often couldn't take my eyes away in fear of something appearing if I did. Somehow, every time I looked at that doorway, the door was wide open. And the door wasn't weak, either. It worked perfectly fine and wouldn't open unless you turned the knob. I'd ask my dad to close it before I went to bed, and it would stay closed for a bit, until it just slid open again. I'm not a door specialist, but it was just arguably creepy. But wait, there's more. Now that we're older and out of that house, me and my brother found out that we shared a terrifying experience. We both saw something incredibly creepy in the same place. I remember it vaguely. It was a small, neutral, glowing white face in the playroom. It looked a bit like a little kid from my memory. It had no body, just a pure white face in the dark. It was just around my height, and its eyes were kind of just not there. I don't remember much, but I remember it was the single most terrifying thing I'd been through. I don't know if I hallucinated or what, but I know it felt incredibly real at the time. Maybe it was a dream or something, because all I remember is seeing that fucking face, getting scared, and running back to my bed. I don't think I screamed, but I seriously don't remember. I kind of love/hate thinking about it, because it just makes my hair stand on edge. Thanks to that house, I have now been diagnosed with anxiety. I'm taking medication for it, and I'm all right, but I thought it was worth noting. I could go on, but I can't really think of anything else right now. Maybe my next post should be about the attic or basement. Nothing really happened there, but they freaked me out, for sure. I now live overseas, but growing up, I lived in an Edwardian-era townhouse in a town on the coast of the UK for about 10 years. This house was haunted by at least 2 people that I know of, and potentially more. The first ghost I came across, I shall refer to him as Mr. Coat, was a dark, intimidating shadow in the shape of a large man wearing a long coat. He always stayed standing at the front door all night, almost like he was keeping a guard out for something every night. The front door and hallway was directly in front of the staircase, so to get downstairs, for example, to get water, you would have to walk past him. Sometimes you would see his shadow, and other times you wouldn't, but you would always feel his presence. The only time I've ever seen Mr. Coat outside of his hallway was when I returned home after several years away. I woke up, and he was in the room I was sleeping in, by the old boarded-up fireplace, before he disappeared. The second occupant of the house is an older woman who we believe fell down the stairs of the house and never left. You would always see her around the stairs, and occasionally, with no one else in the house, you would hear a female speaking to you as you walked up and down the stairs. There are also several other strange things that have happened over the years that we have been unable to tie to any particular individual ghost or phenomena. Multiple things go missing throughout the house and turn up in strange places. I've had shoes go missing and appear outside, shopping left up the stairs and in random rooms, etc. Nothing ever malicious, but a definite sense of a mischievous joke. We've also experienced unexplained hot spots in one specific room near the old boarded-up fireplace, lights turning on and off, and footsteps when no one else is home. The strangest experience by far, though, happened on the 11th of November. Around 10 a.m., the house went mad. Lights and other electronics turning on and off. Doors started slamming, and footsteps all throughout the house, and what sounded like murmuring. It passed after a couple of minutes, and it's never happened again to that extent, but it was very strange.